This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 45. Confidences. All the rest of that day Molly was depressed and not well. Having anything to conceal was so unusual, almost so unprecedented a circumstance with her, that it preyed upon her in every way. It was a nightmare that she could not shake off. She did so wish to forget it all, and yet every little occurrence seemed to remind her of it. The next morning's post brought several letters, one from Roger for Cynthia, and Molly, letterless herself, looked at Cynthia as she read it, with wistful sadness. It appeared to Molly as though Cynthia should have no satisfaction in these letters until she had told him what was her exact position with Mr. Preston. Yet Cynthia was colouring and dimpling up as she always did at any pretty words of praise, or admiration, or love. But Molly's thoughts and Cynthia's reading were both interrupted by a little triumphant sound from Mrs. Gibson, as she pushed a letter she had just received to her husband, with a "There! I must say I expected that." Then turning to Cynthia, she explained, "It is a letter from Uncle Kirkpatrick, love. So kind, wishing you to go and stay with them, and help them to cheer up Helen. Poor Helen! I am afraid she is far from well. But we could not have had her here without disturbing dear papa in his consulting room, and though I could have relinquished my dressing room, so I said in my letter how you were grieved, you above all of us, because you are such a friend of Helen's, you know, and how you long to be of use, as I am sure you do, and so now they want you to go up directly, for Helen has quite set her heart upon it." Cynthia's eyes sparkled. "I shall like going," said she. "All but leaving you, Molly," she added in a lower tone, as if suddenly smitten with some compunction. "Can you be ready to go up by the bang-up to-night?" said Mr. Gibson. "For curious enough, after more than 20 years of quiet practice at Hollingford, I am summoned up to-day for the first time to a consultation in London, to-morrow. I am afraid Mrs. Cumnor is worse, my dear." "You don't say so! Poor dear lady, what a shock it is to me! I'm so glad I've had some breakfast. I could not have eaten anything." "Nay, I only say she is worse. With her complaint, being worse may be only a preliminary to being better. Don't take my words for more than their literal meaning." "Thank you. How kind and reassuring dear papa always is. About your gowns, Cynthia?" "Oh, they are all right, mamma, thank you. I shall be quite ready by 4 o'clock. Molly, will you come with me and help me to pack? I wanted to speak to you, dear," said she, as soon as they had gone upstairs. "It is such a relief to get away from a place haunted by that man. But I'm afraid you thought I was glad to leave you, and indeed I am not." There was a little flavour of protesting too much about this, but Molly did not perceive it. She only said, "Indeed I did not. I know from my own feelings how you must dislike meeting a man in public in a different manner from what you have done in private. I shall try not to see Mr. Preston again for a long, long time, I'm sure. And Helen Kirkpatrick. But, Cynthia, you have not told me one word out of Roger's letter. Please, how is he? Has he quite got over his attack of fever?" "Yes, quite. He writes in such very good spirits. A great deal about birds and beasts as usual, and habits of natives, and things of that kind. You may read from there," indicating a place in the letter, "to there, if you can, and I tell you what, I'll trust you with it, Molly, while I pack, and that shows my sense of your honour, but not what you might read at all, only you'll find the love-making dull. But make a little account of where he is, and what he is doing, date, and that sort of thing, and send it to his father." Molly took the letter down without a word, and began to copy it at the writing-table, often reading over what she was allowed to read, often pausing, her cheek on her hand, her eyes on the letter, and letting her imagination rove to the writer, and all the scenes in which she had either seen him herself, or in which her fancy had painted him. She was startled from her meditations by Cynthia's sudden entrance into the drawing-room, looking the picture of glowing delight. "No one here! What a blessing! Ah, Miss Molly, you are more eloquent than you believe yourself. Look here," holding up a large full envelope, and then quickly replacing it in her pocket, as if she was afraid of being seen. "What's the matter, sweet one?" coming up and caressing Molly. "Is it worrying itself over that letter? Why, don't you see that these are my very own horrible letters that I'm going to burn directly, that Mr. Preston has had the grace to send me, thanks to you, little Molly. Cuishe ma crie, pulse of my heart, The letters have been hanging over my head like somebody's sword for these 2 years." "Oh, I am so glad," said Molly, rousing up a little. "I never thought he would have sent them. He is better than I believed him. And now it is all over. I am so glad. You quite think he means to give up all claim over you by this, don't you, Cynthia?" "He may claim, but I won't be claimed. And he has no proofs now. It is the most charming relief, and I owe it all to you, you precious little lady. Now there is only one thing more to be done, and if you would but do it for me," coaxing and caressing while she asked the question. "Oh, Cynthia, don't ask me. I cannot do any more. You don't know how sick I go when I think of yesterday and Mr. Sheepshanks' look. It is only a very little thing. I won't burden your conscience with telling you how I get my letters, but it is not through a person I can trust with money, and I must force him to take back his 23 odd shillings. I have put it together at the rate of 5 per cent, and it's sealed up. Oh, Molly, I should go off with such a light heart if you would only try to get it safely to him. It's the last thing. There would be no immediate hurry, you know. You might meet him by chance in a shop, in the street, even at a party, and if you only had it with you in your pocket, there would be nothing so easy." Molly was silent. "Papa would give it to him. There would be no harm in that. I would tell him he must ask no questions as to what it was." "Very well," said Cynthia. "Have it your own way. I think my way is the best, for if any of this affair comes out. But you've done a great deal for me already, and I won't blame you now for declining to do any more." "I do so dislike having these underhand dealings with him," pleaded Molly. "Underhand? Just simply giving him a letter from me? If I left a note for Miss Browning, should you dislike giving it to her?" "You know that's very different. I could do it openly." "And yet there might be writing in that, and there would not be a line with the money. It would only be the winding up, the honourable, honest winding up of an affair which has worried me for years. But do as you like." "Give it me," said Molly. "I will try." "There's a darling! You can but try, and if you can't give it to him in private without getting yourself into a scrape, why, keep it till I come back again. He shall have it then, whether he will or no." Molly looked forward to her tête-à-tête 2 days with Mrs. Gibson with very different anticipations to those with which she had welcomed the similar intercourse with her father. In the first place, there was no accompanying the travellers to the inn from which the coach started. Leave-taking in the market-place was quite out of the bounds of Mrs. Gibson's sense of propriety. Besides this, it was a gloomy, rainy evening, and candles had to be brought in at an unusually early hour. There would be no break for 6 hours, no music, no reading, but the 2 ladies would sit at their worsted work, pattering away at small talk, with not even the usual break of dinner, for, to suit the requirements of those who were leaving, they had already dined early. But Mrs. Gibson meant to make Molly happy, and tried to be an agreeable companion. Only Molly was not well, and uneasy about many apprehended cares and troubles, and at such hours of indisposition as she was then passing through, apprehensions take the shape of certainties, lying await in our paths. Molly would have given a good deal to have shaken off all these feelings, unusual enough to her, but the very house and furniture and rain-blurred outer landscape seemed steeped with unpleasant associations, most of them dating from the last few days. "You and I must go on the next journey, I think, my dear," said Mrs. Gibson, almost chiming in with Molly's wish that she could get away from Hollingford into some new air and life, for a week or 2. "We have been stay-at-homes for a long time, and variety of scene is so desirable for the young. But I think the travellers will be wishing themselves at home by this nice bright fireside. There's no place like home, as the poet says. 'Mid pleasures and palaces, although I may roam,' it begins, and it's both very pretty and very true. It's a great blessing to have such a dear little home as this, is it not, Molly?" "Yes," said Molly, rather drearily, having something of the toujours perdrix feeling of the moment. If she could have gone away with her father, just for 2 days, how pleasant it would have been! "To be sure, love, it would be very nice for you and me to go a little journey all by ourselves. You and I, no one else. If it were not such miserable weather, we would have gone off on a little impromptu tour. I've been longing for something of the kind for some weeks, but we live such a restricted kind of life here. I declare sometimes I get quite sick of the very sight of the chairs and tables that I know so well. And one misses the others too. It seems so flat and deserted without them." "Yes, we are very forlorn to night, but I think it's partly owing to the weather." Nonsense, dear. I can't have you giving in to the silly fancy of being affected by the weather. Poor dear Mr. Kirkpatrick used to say, "A cheerful heart makes its own sunshine." He would say it to me in his pretty way whenever I was a little low, for I am a complete barometer. You may really judge the state of the weather by my spirits. I have always been such a sensitive creature. It is well for Cynthia that she does not inherit it. I don't think her easily affected in any way, do you? Molly thought for a moment or two, and then replied, "No, she is certainly not easily affected. Not deeply affected, perhaps I should say. Many girls, for instance, would have been touched by the admiration she excited, I may say the attentions she received while she was at her uncle's last summer." "At Mr. Kirkpatrick's?" "Yes. There was Mr. Henderson, that young lawyer. That's to say, he is studying law, but he has a good private fortune and is likely to have more, so he can only be what I call playing at law. Mr. Henderson was over head and ears in love with her. It is not my fancy, although I grant mothers are partial, and both Mr. and Mrs. Kirkpatrick noticed it, and in one of Mrs. Kirkpatrick's letters she said that poor Mr. Henderson was going into Switzerland for the long vacation, doubtless to try and forget Cynthia. But she really believed he would find it only dragging at each remove a lengthening chain. I thought it such a refined quotation, and altogether worded so prettily. You must know Aunt Kirkpatrick some day, Molly, my love. She is what I call a woman of a truly elegant mind." "I can't help thinking it was a pity that Cynthia did not tell them of her engagement." "It is not an engagement, my dear. How often must I tell you that?" "But what am I to call it?" "I don't see why you need to call it anything. Indeed, I don't understand what you mean by it. You should always try to express yourself intelligibly. It is really one of the first principles of the English language. In fact, philosophers might ask, what is language given us for at all, if it is not that we may make our meaning understood?" "But there is something between Cynthia and Roger. They are more to each other than I am to Osborne, for instance. What am I to call it?" "You should not couple your name with that of any unmarried young man. It is so difficult to teach you delicacy, child. Perhaps one may say there is a peculiar relation between dear Cynthia and Roger, but it is very difficult to characterize it. I have no doubt that is the reason she shrinks from speaking about it. For, between ourselves, Molly, I really sometimes think it will come to nothing. He is so long away, and, privately speaking, Cynthia is not very, very constant. I once knew her very much taken before. That little affair is quite gone by, and she was very civil to Mr. Henderson in her way. I fancy she inherits it, for when I was a girl I was beset by lovers, and could never find in my heart to shake them off. You have not heard dear papa say anything of the old Squire, or dear Osborne, have you? It seems so long since we have heard or seen anything of Osborne. But he must be quite well, I think, or we should have heard of it." "I believe he is quite well. Some one said the other day that they had met him riding. It was Mrs. Goodenough, now I remember, and that he was looking stronger than he had done for years." "Indeed! I am truly glad to hear it. I was always fond of Osborne, and, do you know, I never really took to Roger. I respected him and all that, of course, but to compare him with Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson is so handsome and well bred, and gets all his gloves from Houbigant." It was true that they had not seen anything of Osborne Hamley for a long time. But, as often happens, just after they had been speaking about him, he appeared. It was on the day following Mr. Gibson's departure that Mrs. Gibson had received one of the notes, not so common now as formerly, from the family in town, asking her to go over to the Towers and find a book or a manuscript or something or other that Lady Cumnor wanted with all an invalid's impatience. It was just the kind of employment she required for an amusement on a gloomy day, and it put her into a good humour immediately. There was a certain confidential importance about it, and it was a variety, and it gave her the pleasant drive in a fly up the noble avenue, and the sense of being the temporary mistress of all the grand rooms once so familiar to her. She asked Molly to accompany her, out of an access of kindness, but was not at all sorry when Molly excused herself and preferred stopping at home. At 11 o'clock Mrs. Gibson was off, all in her Sunday best, to use the servant's expression, which she herself would so have contemned, well dressed, in order to impose on the servants at the Towers, for there was no one else to be seen, or to be seen by. "I shall not be at home until the afternoon, my dear, but I hope you will not find it dull. I don't think you will, for you are something like me, my love, never less alone than when alone, as one of the great authors has justly expressed it. Molly enjoyed her house to herself to the full as much as Mrs. Gibson would enjoy having the Towers to herself. She ventured on having her lunch brought up on a tray into the drawing room, so that she might eat her sandwiches while she went on with her book. In the middle, Mr. Osborne Hamley was announced. He came in looking wretchedly ill, in spite of the purblind Mrs. Goodenough's report of his healthy appearance. "This call is not on you, Molly," said he, after the first greetings were over. "I was in hopes I might have found your father at home. I thought lunch time was the best hour." He had sate down, as if thoroughly glad of the rest, and fallen into a languid stooping position, as if it had become so natural to him that no sense of what were considered good manners sufficed to restrain him now. "I hope you did not want to see him professionally," said Molly, wondering if she was wise in alluding to his health, yet urged to it by her real anxiety. "Yes, I did. I suppose I may help myself to a biscuit and a glass of wine? No, don't ring for more. I could not eat it if it was here. But I just want a mouthful. This is quite enough, thank you. When will your father be back?" "He was summoned to London. Lady Cumnor is worse. I fancy there is some operation going on, but I don't know. He will be back to-morrow night." "Very well, then I must wait. Perhaps I shall be better by that time. I think it's half fancy, but I should like your father to tell me so. He will laugh at me, I daresay, but I don't think I shall mind that. He always is severe on fanciful patients, is he not, Molly?" Molly thought that if he saw Osborne's looks just now, he would hardly think him fanciful, or be inclined to be severe. But she only said, "Papa enjoys a joke at everything, you know. It is a relief after all the sorrow he sees." "Very true. There's a great deal of sorrow in the world. I don't think it's a very happy place after all. So Cynthia has gone to London," he added after a pause. "I think I should like to have seen her again. Poor old Roger! He loves her very dearly, Molly," he said. Molly hardly knew how to answer him in all this, she was so struck by the change in both voice and manner. "Mamma has gone to the Towers," she began at length. "Lady Cumnor wanted several things that mamma only can find. She will be sorry to miss you. We were speaking of you only yesterday, and she said how long it was since we had seen you." "I think I have grown careless. I have often felt so weary and ill, that it was all I could do to keep up a brave face before my father." "Why did you not come and see papa?" said Molly, "or write to him?" "I cannot tell. I drifted on sometimes better and sometimes worse, till to-day I mustered up pluck and came to hear what your father has got to tell me, and all for no use it seems." "I am very sorry, but it is only for 2 days. He shall go and see you as soon as ever he returns." "He must not alarm my father, remember, Molly," said Osborne, lifting himself by the arms of his chair into an upright position, and speaking eagerly for a moment. "I wish to God Roger was at home," said he, falling back into the old posture. "I can't help understanding you," said Molly. "You think yourself very ill, but is not it that you are tired just now?" She was not sure if she ought to have understood what was passing in his mind, but as she did, she could not help speaking a true reply. "Well, sometimes I do think I'm very ill, and then again, I think it's only the moping life sets me fancying and exaggerating." He was silent for some time. Then, as if he had taken a sudden resolution, he spoke again. "You see, there are others depending upon me, upon my health. You have not forgotten what you heard that day in the library at home? No, I know you have not. I have seen the thought of it in your eyes often since then. I did not know you at that time. I think I do now." "Don't go on talking so fast," said Molly. "Rest. No one will interrupt us. I will go on with my sewing, and when you want to say anything more, I shall be listening." For she had been alarmed at the strange pallor that had come over his face. "Thank you." After a time he roused himself, and began to speak very quietly, as if on an indifferent matter of fact. "The name of my wife is Amy. Amy Hamley, of course. She lives at Bishopfield, a village near Winchester. Write it down, but keep it to yourself. She is a Frenchwoman, a Roman Catholic, and was a servant. She is a thoroughly good woman. I must not say how dear she is to me. I dare not. I meant once to have told Cynthia, but she did not seem quite to consider me as a brother. Perhaps she was shy of a new relation, but you'll give my love to her all the same. It is a relief to think that some one else has my secret, and that you are like one of us, Molly. I can trust you almost as I can trust Roger. I feel better already now I feel that some one else knows the whereabouts of my wife and child." "Child!" said Molly, surprised. But before he could reply, Maria had announced, "Miss Phoebe Browning." "Fold up that paper," said he quickly, putting something into her hands. "It is only for yourself." End of chapter 45. Read by Tora in Yellowstone National Park, December 2006. Is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 46. Hollingford Gossips. "My dear Molly, why didn't you come and dine with us? I said to sister I would come and scold you well. Oh, Mr. Osborne Hamley, is that you?" And a look of mistaken intelligence at the tête-à-tête she disturbed came so perceptibly into Miss Phoebe's face that Molly caught Osborne's sympathetic eye, and both smiled at the notion. "I'm sure one must sometimes. I see our dinner would have been—" Then she recovered herself into a connected sentence. "We only just heard of Mrs. Gibson's having a fly from the George, because sister sent our Nancy to pay for a couple of rabbits Tom Ostler had snared. I hope we shan't be taken for poachers, Mr. Osborne. Snaring doesn't require a licence, I believe. And she heard he was gone off with the fly to the Towers with your dear mamma. For Cox, who drives the fly in general, has sprained his ankle. We had just finished dinner, but when Nancy and Tom Ostler would not be back till night, I said, 'Why, there's that poor dear girl left all alone by herself, and her mother such a friend of ours, when she was alive, I mean. But I'm sure I'm glad I'm mistaken.'" Osborne said, "I came to speak to Mr. Gibson, not knowing he had gone to London, and Miss Gibson kindly gave me some of her lunch. I must go now." "Oh dear, I'm so sorry," fluttered out Miss Phoebe. "I disturbed you, but it was with the best intentions. I always was mal à propos from a child." But Osborne was gone before she had finished her apologies. Before he left, his eyes met Molly's with a strange look of yearning farewell that struck her at the time, and that she remembered strongly afterward. "Such a nice suitable thing, and I came in the midst and spoilt it all. I'm sure you're very kind, my dear, considering—" "Considering what, my dear Miss Phoebe? If you are conjecturing a love affair between Mr. Osborne Hamley and me, you are never more mistaken in your life. I think I told you so once before. Please do believe me." "Oh yes, I remember. And somehow sister got it into her head it was Mr. Preston, I recollect." "One thing is just as wrong as the other," said Molly, smiling, and trying to look perfectly indifferent, but going extremely red from the annoyance at the mention of Mr. Preston's name. It was very difficult for her to keep up any conversation, for her heart was full of Osborne, his changed appearance, his melancholy words of foreboding, and his confidences about his wife, French, Catholic, servant. Molly could not help trying to piece these strange facts together by imaginations of her own, and found it very hard work to attend to kind Miss Phoebe's unceasing patter. She came up to the point, however, when the voice ceased, and could recall, in a mechanical manner, the echo of the last words, which, from both Miss Phoebe's look and the dying accent that lingered in Molly's ear, she perceived to be a question. Miss Phoebe was asking her if she would go out with her. She was going to Grinstead's, the bookseller of Hollingford, who, in addition to his regular business, was the agent for the Hollingford Book Society, received their subscriptions, kept their accounts, ordered their books from London, and, on payment of a small salary, allowed the society to keep their volumes on shelves in his shop. It was the centre of news and gossip, the club, as it were, of the little town. Everybody who pretended to gentility in the place belonged to it. It was a test of gentility, indeed, rather than of education or a love of literature. No shopkeeper would have thought of offering himself as a member, however great his general interest and love of reading, while it boasted upon the list of subscribers most of the county families in the neighbourhood, some of whom subscribed to the Hollingford Book Society as a sort of duty belonging to their stations, without often using their privilege of reading the books, while there were residents in the little town, such as Mrs. Goodenough, who privately thought reading a great waste of time that might be much better employed in sewing and knitting and pastry making, but who nevertheless belonged to it as a mark of station, just as these good motherly women would have thought it a terrible come down in the world if they had not had a pretty young servant maid to fetch them home from the tea parties at night. At any rate, Grinstead's was a very convenient place for a lounge. In that view of the book society everyone agreed. Molly went upstairs to get ready to accompany Miss Phoebe, and on opening one of her drawers, she saw Cynthia's envelope containing the notes she owed Mr. Preston, carefully sealed up like a letter. This was what Molly had so unwillingly promised to deliver, the last final stroke to the affair. Molly took it up, hating it. For a time she had forgotten it, and now it was here facing her, and she must try and get rid of it. She put it in her pocket for the chances of the walk and the day, and fortune for once seemed to befriend her, for, on their entering Grinstead's shop, in which 2 or 3 people were now, as always, congregated, making play of examining the books, or business of writing down the titles of new works in the order book, there was Mr. Preston. He bowed as they came in; he could not help that. But at the sight of Molly he looked as ill-tempered and out of humour as a man could do. She was connected in his mind with defeat and mortification, and besides, the sight of her called up what he desired now above all things to forget, namely, the deep conviction received through Molly's simple earnestness of Cynthia's dislike to him. If Miss Phoebe had seen the scowl upon his handsome face, she might have undeceived her sister in her suppositions about him and Molly. But Miss Phoebe, who did not consider it quite maidenly to go and stand close to Mr. Preston, and survey the shelves of books in such close proximity to a gentleman, found herself an errand at the other end of the shop, and occupied herself in buying writing paper. Molly fingered her valuable letter as it lay in her pocket. Did she dare to cross over to Mr. Preston and give it to him, or not? While she was still undecided, shrinking always just at the moment when she thought she had got her courage up for action, Miss Phoebe, having finished her purchase, turned round, and after looking a little pathetically at Mr. Preston's back, said to Molly in a whisper, "I think we'll go to Johnson's now, and come back for the books in a little while." So across the street to Johnson's they went, but no sooner had they entered the draper's shop than Molly's conscience smote her for her cowardice and loss of a good opportunity. "I'll be back directly," said she, as soon as Miss Phoebe was engaged with her purchases, and Molly ran across to Grinstead's, without looking either to the right or the left. She had been watching the door, and she knew that no Mr. Preston had issued forth. She ran in. He was at the counter now, talking to Grinstead himself. Molly put the letter into his hand, to his surprise, and almost against his will, and turned round to go back to Miss Phoebe. At the door of the shop stood Mrs. Goodenough, arrested in the act of entering, staring with her round eyes, made still rounder and more owl-like by the spectacles, to see Molly Gibson giving Mr. Preston a letter, which he, conscious of being watched and favouring underhand practices habitually, put quickly into his pocket unopened. Perhaps, if he had had time for reflection, he would not have scrupled to put Molly to open shame by rejecting what she so eagerly forced upon him. There was another long evening to be got through with Mrs. Gibson, but on this occasion there was the pleasant occupation of dinner, which took up at least an hour, for it was one of Mrs. Gibson's fancies, one which Molly chafed against, to have every ceremonial gone through in the same stately manner for 2 as for 20. So, although Molly knew full well, and her stepmother knew full well, and Maria knew full well, that neither Mrs. Gibson nor Molly touched dessert, it was set on the table with as much form as if Cynthia had been at home, who delighted in almonds and raisins, or Mr. Gibson been there, who could never resist dates, although he protested against persons in their station of life having a formal dessert set out before them every day. And Mrs. Gibson herself apologized, as it were, to Molly to-day, in the same words she had often used to Mr. Gibson. "It's no extravagance, for we need not eat it, I never do, but it looks well and makes Maria understand what is required in the daily life of every family of position." All through the evening Molly's thoughts wandered far and wide, though she managed to keep up a show of attentions to what Mrs. Gibson was saying. She was thinking of Osborne, and his abrupt half-finished confidence, his ill looks. She was wondering when Roger would come home, and longing for his return, as much, she said to herself, for Osborne's sake as for her own. Then she checked herself. What had she to do with Roger? Why should she long for his return? It was Cynthia who was doing this, only somehow he was such a true friend to Molly that she could not help thinking of him as a staff and a stay in the troublous times which appeared to lie not far ahead this evening. Then Mr. Preston and her little adventure with him came uppermost. How angry he looked! How could Cynthia have liked him even enough to get into this abominable scrape, which was, however, all over now? And so she ran on in her fancies and imaginations, little dreaming that very night how much talk was going on not half a mile from where she sate sewing, which would prove that the scrape, as she called it in her girlish phraseology, was not all over. Scandal sleeps in the summer, comparatively speaking. Its nature is the reverse of that dormouse. Warm ambient air, loiterings abroad, gardenings, flowers to talk about, and preserves to make, soothe the wicked imp to slumber in the parish of Hollingford in the summer time. But when evenings grew short, and people gathered round the fires and put their feet in a circle, not on the fenders, that was not allowed, then there was time for confidential conversation. Or, in the pauses allowed for the tea trays to circulate among the card tables, when those who were peaceably inclined tried to stop the warm discussions about the odd trick, and the rather wearisome feminine way of shouldering the crutch and showing how the fields were won, small crumbs and scraps of the daily news came up to the surface, such as Martindale has raised the price of his best joints a halfpenny in the pound, or it's a shame of Sir Harry to order in another book on Farriery in the Book Society. Phoebe and I tried to read it, but really there is no general interest in it. Or, I wonder what Mr. Ashton will do now Nancy is going to be married. Why, she has been with him these 17 years. It's a very foolish thing for a woman of her age to be thinking of matrimony, and so I told her when I met her in the market-place this morning. So said Miss Browning on the night in question, her hand of cards lying by her on the green baize-covered table, when she munched the rich pound-cake of a certain Miss Dawes, lately come to inhabit Hollingford. "Matrimony is not so bad as you think for, Miss Browning," said Mrs. Goodenough, standing up for the holy estate into which she had twice entered. "If I had seen Nancy, I should have given her my mind very different. It's a great thing to be able to settle what you'll have for dinner, with never one interfering with you." "If that's all," said Miss Browning, drawing herself up, "I can do that, and perhaps better than a woman who has a husband to please." "No one can say as I didn't please my husbands, both on 'em, though Jeremy was tickler in his taste than poor Harry Beaver. But as I used to say to 'em, leave the victual to me. It's better for you than knowing what's to come beforehand. The stomach likes to be taken by surprise. And neither of 'em ever repented 'em of their confidence. You may take my word for it. Beans and bacon will taste better, and Mr. Ashton's Nancy in her own house, than all the sweetbreads and spring chickens she's been a doing for him this 17 years. But if I chose I could tell you of something as would interest you all a deal more than old Nancy's marriage to a widower with 9 children, only as the young folks themselves is meeting in private, clandestine like, it's perhaps not for me to tell their secrets." "I'm sure I don't want to hear of clandestine meetings between young men and young women," said Miss Browning, throwing up her head. "It's disgrace enough to people themselves, I consider, if they enter on a love affair without the proper sanction of parents. I know public opinion has changed on the subject, but when poor Gracia was married to Mr. Byerley, he wrote to my father without ever having so much as paid her a compliment, or said more than the trivial and commonplace things to her, and my father and mother sent for her into my father's study, and she said she never was so much frightened in her life, and they said it was a very good offer, and Mr. Byerley was a very worthy man, and they hoped that she would behave properly to him when he came to supper that night. And after that he was allowed to come twice a week till they were married. My mother and I sat at our work in the bow window of the rectory drawing room, and Gracia and Mr. Byerley at the other end, and my mother always called my attention to some flower or plant in the garden when it struck 9, for that was his time for going. Without offence to the present company, I am rather inclined to look upon matrimony as a weakness to which some very worthy people are prone. But if they must be married, let them make the best of it, and go through the affair with dignity and propriety. Or, if there are misdoings and clandestine meetings, and such things at any rate, never let me hear about them. I think it's you to play, Miss Dawes. You'll excuse my frankness on the subject of matrimony. Mrs. Goodenough there can tell you I'm a very outspoken person." "It's not the outspeaking, it's what you say that goes against me, Miss Browning," said Mrs. Goodenough, affronted, yet ready to play her card as soon as needed. And as for Mrs. Dawes, she was too anxious to get into the genteelest of all Hollingford society to object to whatever Miss Browning, who, in right of being a deceased rector's daughter, rather represented the selectest circle of the little town, advocated celibacy, marriage, bigamy, or polygamy. So the remainder of the evening passed over without any farther reference to the secret Mrs. Goodenough was burning to disclose, unless a remark made, apropos de rien, by Miss Browning, during the silence of a deal, could be supposed to have connection with the previous conversation. She said suddenly and abruptly, "I don't know what I have done that any man should make me his slave." If she was referring to any prospect of matrimonial danger she saw opening before her fancy, she might have been comforted. But it was a remark of which no one took any notice, all being far too much engaged in the rubber. Only when Miss Browning took her early leave, for Miss Phoebe had a cold and was an invalid at home, Mrs. Goodenough burst out with, "Well, now I may speak out my mind, and say as how if there was a slave between us two, when Goodenough was alive, it wasn't me, and I don't think as it was pretty in Miss Browning to give herself such airs on her virginity, when there was 4 widows in the room, who'd had 6 honest men among 'em for husbands. No offence, Miss Airy," addressing an unfortunate little spinster, who found herself the sole representative of celibacy, now that Miss Browning was gone. "I could tell her of a girl as she's very fond on, who's on the high road to matrimony, and in as cunning a way as I ever heerd on, going out at dusk to meet her sweetheart, just as if she was my Sally or your Jenny. And her name is Molly, too, which, as I have often thought, shows a low taste in them as first called her so. She might as well be a scullery maid at once. Not that she's picked up anybody common. She's looked about her for a handsome fellow and a smart young man enough." Every one around the table looked curious and intent on the disclosures being made, except the hostess, Mrs. Dawes, who smiled intelligence with her eyes, and knowingly pursed up her mouth until Mrs. Goodenough had finished her tale. And then she said demurely, "I suppose you mean Mr. Preston and Miss Gibson." "Why, who told you?" said Mrs. Goodenough, turning round upon her in surprise. "You can't say as I did. There's many a Molly in Hollingford, besides her, though none, perhaps, in such a genteel station of life. I never named her, I'm sure." "No, but I know. I could tell my tale too," continued Mrs. Dawes. "No, could you really?" said Mrs. Goodenough, very curious and a little jealous. "Yes. My uncle Sheepshanks came upon them in the Park Avenue. He startled him a good deal, he said, and when he taxed Mr. Preston with being with his sweetheart, he didn't deny it. Well, now so much has come out, I'll tell you what I know. Only, ladies, I wouldn't wish to do the girl an unkind turn, so you must keep what I've got to tell you a secret." Of course they promised. That was easy. "My Hannah, as married Tom Oakes and lives in Pearson Lane, was a gathering of damsons only about a week ago, and Molly Gibson was a walking fast down the lane, quite in a hurry like to meet some one, and Hannah's little Anna Maria fell down, and Molly, who's a kind-hearted lass enough, picked her up. So if Hannah had had her doubts before, she had none then." "But there was no one with her, was there?" asked one of the ladies anxiously, as Mrs. Goodenough stopped to finish her piece of cake just at this crisis. "No. I said she looked as if she was going to meet some one, and by comes Mr. Preston running out of the woods just beyond Hannah's, and says he, 'A cup of water, please, good woman, for a lady has fainted, or is hysterical, or something.' Now, though he didn't know Hannah, Hannah knew him. More folks know Tom Fool than Tom Fool knows, asking Mr. Preston's pardon, for he's no fool whatever he be. And I could tell you more, and what I seed with my own eyes. I seed her give him a letter in Grinstead's shop only yesterday, and he looked as black as thunder at her, for he seed me if she didn't." "It's a very suitable kind of thing," said Miss Airy. "Why do they make such a mystery of it?" "Some folks like it," said Mrs. Dawes. "It adds zest to it all, to do the courting underhand." "Ay, it's like salt to their victual," put in Miss Goodenough. "But I didn't think Molly Gibson was one of that sort, I didn't." "The Gibsons hold themselves very high?" cried Mrs. Dawes, more as an inquiry than an assertion. "Mrs. Gibson has called upon me." "Ay, you're like to be a patient of the doctor's," put in Mrs. Goodenough. She seemed to me very affable, though she is so intimate with the Countess and the family at the Towers, and is quite the lady herself. Dines late, I've heard, and everything in style." "Style! Very different style to what Bob Gibson, her husband, was used to when he first came here. Glad of a mutton chop in his surgery, for I doubt if he'd a fire anywhere else. We called him Bob Gibson then, but none of us dare bob him now. I'd as soon think o' calling him Sweep." "I think it looks very bad for Miss Gibson," said one lady, rather anxious to bring back the conversation to the more interesting present time. But as soon as Mrs. Goodenough heard this natural comment on the disclosure she had made, she fired round on the speaker. "Not at all bad, and I'll trouble you not to use such a word as that about Molly Gibson, as I've known all her life. It's odd, if you will. I was odd myself as a girl. I could never abide a plate of gathered gooseberries, but I must needs go sulk behind a bush and gather 'em for myself. It's some folks' taste, though it mayn't be Miss Brownie's, who'd have all the courting done under the nose of the family. All as I ever said was that I was surprised at it in Molly Gibson, and that I'd a thought it was liker the pretty minx of Cynthia, as they call her. Indeed, at one time I was ready to swear as it was her Mr. Preston was after. Now, ladies, I'll wish you a very good night. I cannot abide waste, and I'll venture for it Sally's letting the candle in the lantern run all to grease, instead of putting it out as I've told her to do, if ever she's got to wait for me." So, with formal dipping curtsies, the ladies separated, but not without thanking Mrs. Dawes for the pleasant evening they had had, a piece of old-fashioned courtesy always gone through in those days. End of chapter 46. Read by Tora in Yellowstone National Park, December 2006. LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 47. Scandal and its Victims. When Mr. Gibson returned to Hollingford, he found an accumulation of business waiting for him, and he was much inclined to complain of the consequences of the 2 days' comparative holiday which had resulted in overwork for the week to come. He had hardly time to speak to his family, he had so immediately to rush off to pressing cases of illness. But Molly managed to arrest him in the hall, standing there with his great coat held out ready for him to put on, but whispering as she did so, "Papa, Mr. Osborne Hamley was here to see you yesterday. He looks very ill, and he's evidently frightened about himself." Mr. Gibson faced about, looked at her for a moment, but all he said was, "I'll go and see him. Don't tell your mother where I'm gone. You've not mentioned this to her, I hope?" "No," said Molly, for she had only told Mrs. Gibson of Osborne's call, not of the occasion for it. "Don't say anything about it. There's no need. Now I think of it, I can't possibly go to-day. But I will go." Something in her father's manner disheartened Molly, who had persuaded herself that Osborne's evident illness was partly nervous, by which she meant imaginary. She had dwelt upon his looks of enjoyment at Miss Phoebe's perplexity, and thought that no one really believing himself to be in danger could have given the merry glances which he had done. But after seeing the seriousness of her father's face, she recurred to the shock she had experienced on first seeing Osborne's changed appearance. All this time Mrs. Gibson was busy reading a letter from Cynthia, which Mr. Gibson had brought from London, for every opportunity of private conveyance was seized upon when postage was so high, and Cynthia had forgotten so many things in her hurried packing that she now sent a list of the clothes which she required. Molly almost wondered that it had not come to her, but she did not understand the sort of reserve that was springing up in Cynthia's mind towards her. Cynthia herself struggled with the feeling, and tried to fight against it by calling herself ungrateful; but the truth was, that she believed that she no longer held her former high place in Molly's estimation, and she could not help turning away from one who knew things to her discredit. She was fully aware of Molly's prompt decision and willing action, where action was especially disagreeable on her behalf, and she knew that Molly would never bring up the past errors and difficulties. But still the consciousness that the good, straightforward girl had learnt that Cynthia had been guilty of so much underhand work cooled her regard, and restrained her willingness of intercourse. Reproach herself with ingratitude as she would, she could not help feeling glad to be away from Molly. It was awkward to speak to her as if nothing had happened. It was awkward to write to her about forgotten ribbons and laces, when their last conversation had been on such different subjects, and had called out such vehement expressions of feeling. So Mrs. Gibson held the list in her hand, and read out the small fragments of news that were intermixed with notices of Cynthia's requirements. "Helen cannot be so very ill," said Molly at length, "or Cynthia would not want her pink muslin and daisy wreath." "I don't see how that follows, I'm sure," replied Mrs. Gibson rather sharply. "Helen would never be so selfish as to tie Cynthia to her side, however ill she was. Indeed, I should not have felt that it was my duty to let Cynthia go to London at all, if I had thought that she was to be perpetually exposed to the depressing atmosphere of a sick room. Besides, it must be so good for Helen to have Cynthia coming in with bright pleasant accounts of the parties she has been to, even if Cynthia disliked gaiety, I should desire her to sacrifice herself and go out as much as she could for Helen's sake. My idea of nursing is that one should not always be thinking of one's own feelings and wishes, but doing those things which will most serve to beguile the weary hours of an invalid. But then, so few people have had to consider the subject as deeply as I have done." Mrs. Gibson here thought it fit to sigh before going on with Cynthia's letter. As far as Molly could make any sense out of this rather incoherent epistle, very incoherently read aloud to her, Cynthia was really pleased and glad to be of use and comfort to Helen, but at the same time very ready to be easily persuaded into the perpetual small gaieties which abounded in her uncle's house in London, even at this dead season of the year. Mrs. Gibson came upon Mr. Henderson's name once, and then went on with a running to herself, which sounded very mysterious, which might as well have been omitted, as all that Cynthia really said about him was, "Mr. Henderson's mother has advised my aunt to consult a certain Dr. Donaldson, who is said to be very clever in such cases as Helen's, but my uncle is not sufficiently sure of the professional etiquette, etc." Then there came a very affectionate, carefully worded message to Molly, implying a good deal more than was said of loving gratitude for the trouble she had taken on Cynthia's behalf. And that was all, and Molly went away a little depressed, she knew not why. The operation on Lady Cumnor had been successfully performed, and in a few days they hoped to bring her down to the Towers to recruit her strength in the fresh country air. The case was one which interested Mr. Gibson extremely, and in which his opinion had been proved to be right, in opposition to that of one or two great names in London. The consequence was that he was frequently consulted and referred to during the progress of her recovery, and, as he had much to do in the immediate circle of his Hollingford practice, as well as to write thoughtful letters to his medical brethren in London, he found it difficult to spare the 3 or 4 hours necessary to go over to Hamley to see Osborne. He wrote to him, however, begging him to reply immediately and detail his symptoms, and from the answer he received he did not imagine that the case was immediately pressing. Osborne, too, deprecated his coming over to Hamley for the express purpose of seeing him. So the visit was deferred to that more convenient season which is so often too late. All these days, the buzzing gossip about Molly's meeting with Mr. Preston, her clandestine correspondence, the tête-à-tête interviews in lonely places, had been gathering strength and assuming the positive form of scandal. The simple innocent girl, who walked through the quiet streets without a thought of being the object of mysterious implications, became for a time the unconscious black sheep of the town. Servants heard part of what was said in their mistresses' drawing-rooms, and exaggerated the sayings amongst themselves with the coarse strengthening of expression common amongst uneducated people. Mr. Preston himself became aware that her name was being coupled with his, though hardly to the extent to which the love of excitement and gossip had carried people's speeches. He chuckled over the mistake, but took no pains to correct it. "It serves her right," said he to himself, "for meddling with other folks' business." And he felt himself avenged for the discomfiture which her menace of appealing to Lady Harriet had caused him, and the mortification he had experienced in learning from her plain-speaking lips how he had been talked over by Cynthia and herself, with personal dislike on the one side, and evident contempt on the other. Besides, if any denial of Mr. Preston stirred up an examination as to the real truth, more might come out of this baffled endeavours to compel Cynthia to keep her engagement to him than he cared to have known. He was angry with himself for still loving Cynthia, loving her in his own fashion, be it understood. He told himself that many a woman of more position and wealth would be glad enough to have him, some of them pretty women too, and he asked himself why he was such a confounded fool as to go on hankering after a penniless girl who was as fickle as the wind. The answer was silly enough, logically, but forcible in fact. Cynthia was Cynthia, and not Venus herself could have been her substitute. In this one thing Mr. Preston was more really true than many worthy men who, seeking to be married, turn with careless facility from the unattainable to the attainable, and keep their feelings and fancy tolerably loose till they find a woman who consents to be their wife. But no one would ever be to Mr. Preston what Cynthia had been, and was, and yet he could have stabbed her in certain of his moods. So Molly, who had come between him and the object of his desire, was not likely to find favour in his sight, or to obtain friendly actions from him. There came a time, not very distant from the evening at Mrs. Dawes', when Molly felt that people looked askance at her. Mrs. Goodenough openly pulled her granddaughter away when the young girl stopped to speak to Molly in the street, and an engagement which the two had for a long walk together was cut very short by a very trumpery excuse. Mrs. Goodenough explained her conduct in the following manner to some of her friends. "You see, I don't think the worse of a girl for meeting her sweetheart here and there and everywhere, till she gets talked about; but then when she does, and Molly Gibson's name is in everybody's mouth, I think it's only fair to Bessy, who has trusted me with Annabella, not to let her daughter be seen with the lass who has managed her matters so badly, as to set folks talking about her. My maxim is this, and it's a very good working one, you may depend on it. Women should mind what they're about, and never be talked of, and if a woman's talked of, the less her friends have to do with her till the talk has died away, the better. So Annabella is not going to have anything to do with Molly Gibson, this visit at any rate." For a good while the Miss Brownings were kept in ignorance of the evil tongues that whispered hard words about Molly. Miss Browning was known to have a temper, and by instinct every one who came in contact with her shrank from irritating that temper by uttering the slightest syllable against the smallest of those creatures over whom she spread the aegis of her love. She would and did reproach them herself. She used to boast that she never spared them, but no one else might touch them with the slightest slur of a passing word. But Miss Phoebe inspired no such terror. The great reason why she did not hear of the gossip against Molly as early as any one was that, although she was not the rose, she lived near the rose. Besides, she was of so tender a nature that even thick-skinned Mrs. Goodenough was unwilling to say what would give Miss Phoebe pain, and it was the newcomer, Mrs. Dawes, who in all ignorance alluded to the town's talk as to something of which Miss Phoebe must be aware. Then Miss Phoebe poured down her questions, although she protested, even with tears, her total disbelief in all the answers she received. It was a small act of heroism on her part to keep all that she there learnt a secret from her sister Sally, and she did for 4 or 5 days, till Miss Browning attacked her one evening with the following speech: "Phoebe, either you've some reason for puffing yourself out with sighs, or you've not. If you have a reason, it's your duty to tell me directly, and if you've no reason, you must break yourself of a bad habit that is growing upon you." "Oh, sister, do you really think it is my duty to tell you? It would be such a comfort, but then I thought I ought not. It will distress you so." "Nonsense! I am so well prepared for misfortune by the frequent contemplation of its possibility, that I believe I can receive any ill news with apparent equanimity and real resignation. Besides, when you said yesterday at breakfast time that you meant to give up the day to making your drawers tidy, I was aware that some misfortune was impending, though of course I could not judge of its magnitude. Is the Highchester Bank broken?" "Oh no, sister," said Miss Phoebe, moving a seat closer to her sister's on the sofa. "Have you really been thinking that? I wish I had told you what I had heard at the very first, if you've been fancying that." "Take warning, Phoebe, and learn to have no concealments from me. I did think we must be ruined, from your ways of going on, eating no meat at dinner, and sighing continually. And now, what is it?" "I hardly know how to tell you, Sally. I really don't." Miss Phoebe began to cry. Miss Browning took hold of her arm and gave her a little sharp shake. "Cry as much as you'd like when you've told me, but don't cry now, child, when you're keeping me on the tenterhooks." "Molly Gibson has lost her character, sister. That's it." "Molly Gibson has done no such thing," said Miss Browning indignantly. "How dare you repeat such stories about poor Mary's child? Never let me hear you say such things again." "I can't help it. Mrs. Dawes told me, and she said it's all over the town. I told her I did not believe a word of it, and I kept it from you, and I think I should have been really ill if I'd kept it to myself any longer. Oh, sister, what are you going to do?" For Miss Browning had risen without speaking a word, and was leaving the room in a stately and determined fashion. I am going to put on my bonnet and things, and then I shall call upon Mrs. Dawes and confront her with her lies." "Oh, don't call them lies, sister. It's such a strong, ugly word. Please call them tallydiddles, for I don't believe she meant any harm. Besides, if they should turn out to be truth! Really, sister, that's the weight on my mind. So many things sounded as if they might be true." "What things?" said Miss Browning, still standing with judicial erectness of position in the middle of the floor. "Why, one story was that Molly had given him a letter." "Who's him? How am I to understand a story told in that silly way?" Miss Browning sate down on the nearest chair, and made up her mind to be patient if she could. "Him is Mr. Preston, and that must be true, because I missed her from my side when I wanted to ask her if she thought the blue would look green by candlelight, as the young man said it would, and she had run across the street, and Mrs. Goodenough was just going into the shop, just as she said she was." Miss Browning's distress was overcoming her anger, so she only said, "Phoebe, I think you'll drive me mad. Do tell me what you've heard from Mrs. Dawes in a sensible and coherent manner for once in your life." "I'm sure I'm trying with all my might to tell you everything just as it happened." "What did you hear from Mrs. Dawes?" "Why, that Molly and Mr. Preston were keeping company just as if she was a maidservant and he was a gardener, meeting at all sorts of improper times and places, and fainting away in his arms, and out at night together, and writing to each other, and slipping their letters into each other's hands. And that was what I was talking about, sister, for I next door to saw that done once. I saw her with my own eyes run across the street to Grinstead's, where he was, for we had just left him there, with a letter in her hand too, which was not there when she came back all fluttered and blushing. But I never thought anything of it at the time, but now all the town is talking about it, and crying shame, and saying they ought to be married." Miss Phoebe sank into sobbing again, but was suddenly roused by a good box on her ear. Miss Browning was standing over her, almost trembling with passion. "Phoebe, if I ever hear you say such things again, I'll turn you out of the house that minute." "I only said what Mrs. Dawes said, and you asked me what it was," replied Miss Phoebe, humbly and meekly. "Sally, you should not have done that." "Never mind whether I should or I shouldn't. That's not the matter in hand. What I've got to decide is how to put a stop to all these lies." "But, Sally, they are not all lies, if you will call them so. I'm afraid some of the things are true, though I stuck to their being false when Mrs. Dawes told me of them. If I go to Mrs. Dawes, and she repeats them to me, I shall slap her face or box her ears, I'm afraid, for I couldn't stand tales being told of poor Mary's daughter, as if they were just a stirring piece of news, like James Horrocks' pig with 2 heads," said Miss Browning, meditating aloud. "That would do harm instead of good, Phoebe. I'm really sorry I boxed your ears, only I should do it again if you said the same things." Phoebe sate down by her sister, and took one of her withered hands and began caressing it, which was her way of accepting her sister's expression of regret. "If I speak to Molly, the child will deny it if she's half as good for nothing as they say, and if she's not, she'll only worry herself to death. No, that won't do. Mrs. Goodenough, but she's a donkey, and if I convinced her, she could never convince any one else. No, Mrs. Dawes, who told you, shall tell me, and I'll tie my hands together inside my mouth, and bind myself over to keep the peace. And when I've heard what is to be heard, I'll put the matter into Mr. Gibson's hands. That's what I'll do. So it's no use your saying anything against it, Phoebe, for I shan't attend to you." Miss Browning went to Mrs. Dawes, and began civilly enough to make inquiries about the reports current in Hollingford about Molly and Mr. Preston. And Mrs. Dawes fell into the snare, and told all the real and fictitious circumstances of the story in circulation, quite unaware of the storm that was gathering, and ready to fall upon her as soon as she stopped speaking. But she had not the long habit of reverence for Miss Browning, which would have kept so many Hollingford ladies from justifying themselves if she found fault. Mrs. Dawes stood up for herself and her own veracity, bringing out fresh scandal, which she said she did not believe, but that many did, and adducing so much evidence as to the truth of what she had said and did believe, that Miss Browning was almost quelled, and sate silent and miserable at the end of Mrs. Dawes' justification of herself. "Well," she said at length, rising up from her chair as she spoke, "I'm very sorry I've lived till this day. It's a blow to me just as if I had heard of such goings on in my own flesh and blood. I suppose I ought to apologize to you, Mrs. Dawes, for what I said, but I've no heart to do it to-day. I ought not to have spoken as I did, but that's nothing to this affair, you see." I hope you do me the justice of perceiving that I only repeated what I had heard on good authority, Miss Browning," said Mrs. Dawes in reply. "My dear, don't repeat evil on any authority unless you can do some good by speaking about it," said Miss Browning, laying her hand on Mrs. Dawes' shoulder. "I'm not a good woman, but I know what is good, and that advice is. And now I think I can tell you that I beg your pardon for flying out upon you so, but God knows what pain you were putting me to. You'll forgive me, won't you, my dear?" Mrs. Dawes felt the hand trembling on her shoulder, and saw the real distress of Miss Browning's mind, so it was not difficult to grant her the requested forgiveness. Then Miss Browning went home, and said but a few words to Phoebe, who indeed saw well enough that her sister had heard the reports confirmed, and needed no further explanation of the cause of the scarcely tasted dinner, and short replies, and saddened looks. Presently Miss Browning sate down and wrote a short note. Then she rang the bell, and told the little maiden who answered it to take it to Mr. Gibson, and if he was out, to see that it was given to him as soon as ever he came home. And then she went and put on her Sunday cap, and Miss Phoebe knew that her sister had written to ask Mr. Gibson to come and be told of the rumours affecting his daughter. Miss Browning was sadly disturbed at the information she had received, and the task that lay before her. She was miserably uncomfortable to herself and irritable to Miss Phoebe, and the netting cotton she was using kept continually snapping and breaking from the jerks of her nervous hands. When the knock at the door was heard, the well-known doctor's knock, Miss Browning took off her spectacles and dropped them on the carpet, breaking them as she did so. And then she bade Miss Phoebe leave the room, as if her presence had cast the evil eye and caused the misfortune. She wanted to look natural, and was distressed at forgetting whether she usually received him sitting or standing. "Well," said he, coming in cheerfully, and rubbing his cold hands as he went straight to the fire, "and what is the matter with us? It's Phoebe, I suppose. I hope none of those old spasms. But after all, a dose or two will set that to rights." "Oh, Mr. Gibson, I wish it was Phoebe or me either," said Miss Browning, trembling more and more. He sate down by her patiently when he saw her agitation, and took her hand in a kind, friendly manner. "Don't hurry yourself. Take your time. I dare say it's not so bad as you fancy, but we'll see about it. There's a great deal of help in the world, much as we abuse it." "Mr. Gibson," said she, "it's your Molly I'm so grieved about. It's out now, and God help us both, and the poor child too, for I'm sure she's been led astray, and not gone wrong by her own free will." "Molly!" said he, fighting against her words. "What's my little Molly been doing or saying?" "Oh, Mr. Gibson, I don't know how to tell you. I never would have named it if I had not been convinced sorely, sorely against my will." "At any rate, you can let me hear what you have heard," said he, putting his elbow on the table, and screening his eyes with his hand. "Not that I am a bit afraid of anything you can hear about my girl," continued he. "Only in this little nest of gossip, it's as well to know what people are talking about." "They say oh, how shall I tell you?" "Go on, can't you?" said he, removing his hand from his blazing eyes. "I'm not going to believe it, so don't be afraid." "But I fear you must believe it. I would not if I could help it. She's been carrying on a clandestine correspondence with Mr. Preston." "Mr. Preston!" exclaimed he. "And meeting him in all sorts of unseemly places and hours out of doors, in the dark, fainting away in his arms, if I must speak out. All the town is talking of it." Mr. Gibson's hand was over his eyes again, and he made no sign, so Miss Browning went on, adding touch to touch. "Mr. Sheepshanks saw them together. They have exchanged notes in Grinstead's shop. She ran after him there." "Be quiet, can't you?" said Mr. Gibson, taking his hand away, and showing his grim set face. "I have heard enough. Don't go on. I said I shouldn't believe it, and I don't. I suppose I must thank you for your telling me, but I can't." "I don't want your thanks," said Miss Browning, almost crying. "I thought you ought to know, for though you're married again, I can't forget that you were dear Mary's husband once upon a time, and Molly's her child." "I'd rather not speak any more about it just at present," said he, not at all replying to Miss Browning's last speech. "I may not control myself as I ought. I only wish I could meet Preston and horsewhip him within an inch of his life. I wish I'd the doctoring of these slanderous gossips. I'd make their tongues lie still for a while. My little girl! What harm has she done them all, that they should go and foul her fair name?" "Indeed, Mr. Gibson, I'm afraid it's all true. I would not have sent for you if I hadn't examined into it. Do ascertain the truth before you do anything violent, such as horsewhipping or poisoning." With all the inconsequence of a man in passion, Mr. Gibson laughed out. "What have I said about horsewhipping or poisoning? Do you think I'd have Molly's name dragged about the streets in connection with any act of violence on my part? Let the report die away as it arose. Time will prove its falsehood." "But I don't think it will, and that's the pity of it," said Miss Browning. "You must do something, but I don't know what." "I shall go home and ask Molly herself what's the meaning of it all. That's all I shall do. It's too ridiculous, knowing Molly as I do. It's perfectly ridiculous." He got up and walked about the room with hasty steps, laughing short unnatural laughs from time to time. "Really, what will they say next? Satan finds some mischief still for idle tongues to do." "Don't talk of Satan, please, in this house. No one knows what may happen if he's lightly spoken about," pleaded Miss Browning. He went on without noticing her, talking to himself. "I've a great mind to leave the place. What food for scandal that piece of folly would give rise to!" Then he was silent for a time, his hands in his pockets, his eyes on the ground, as he continued his quarter-deck march. Suddenly he stopped close to Miss Browning's chair. "I'm thoroughly ungrateful to you for as true a mark of friendship as you've ever shown to me. True or false, it was right that I should know the wretched scandal that was being circulated, and it could not have been pleasant for you to tell it me. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." "Indeed, Mr. Gibson, if it was false I would never have named it, but let it die away." "It's not true, though," he said doggedly, letting drop the hand he had taken in his effusion of gratitude. She shook her head. "I shall always love Molly for her mother's sake," she said. It was a great concession from the correct Miss Browning, but her father did not understand it as such. "You ought to love her for her own. She has done nothing to disgrace herself. I shall go straight home and probe into the truth." As if the poor girl who has been led away into deceit already would scruple much at going on in falsehood, was Miss Browning's remark on this last speech of Mr. Gibson's, but she had discretion enough not to make it until he was well out of hearing. End of chapter 47. Read by Tora in Yellowstone National Park, December 2006. LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 48. An Innocent Culprit. With his head bent down, as if he were facing some keen-blowing wind, and yet there was not a breath of air stirring, Mr. Gibson went swiftly to his own home. He rang at the door-bell, an unusual proceeding on his part. Maria opened the door. "Go and tell Miss Molly she is wanted in the dining-room. Don't say who it is that wants her." There was something in Mr. Gibson's manner that made Maria obey him to the letter, in spite of Molly's surprised question. "Wants me? Who is it, Maria?" Mr. Gibson went into the dining-room, and shut the door for an instant's solitude. He went up to the chimney-piece, took hold of it, and laid his head on his hands, and tried to still the beating of his heart. The door opened. He knew that Molly stood there before he heard her tone of astonishment. "Papa!" "Hush!" said he, turning round sharply. "Shut the door. Come here." She came to him, wondering what was amiss. Her thoughts went to the Hamleys immediately. "Is it Osborne?" she asked, breathless. If Mr. Gibson had not been too much agitated to judge calmly, he might have deduced comfort from these 3 words. But instead of allowing himself to seek for comfort from collateral evidence, he said, "Molly, what is this I hear? That you have been keeping up a clandestine intercourse with Mr. Preston, meeting him in out-of-the-way places, exchanging letters with him in a stealthy way?" Though he had professed to disbelieve all this, and did disbelieve it at the bottom of his soul, his voice was hard and stern, his face was white and grim, and his eyes fixed Molly's with the terrible keenness of their research. Molly trembled all over, but she did not attempt to evade his penetration. If she was silent for a moment, it was because she was rapidly reviewing her relation with regard to Cynthia in this matter. It was but a moment's pause of silence, but it seemed long minutes to one who was craving for a burst of indignant denial. He had taken hold of her two arms just above her wrists, as she had first advanced towards him. He was unconscious of this action, but as his impatience for her words grew upon him, he grasped her more and more tightly in his vice-like hands, till she made a little involuntary sound of pain. And then he let go, and she looked at her soft bruised flesh, with tears gathering fast to her eyes to think that he, her father, should have hurt her so. At the instant it appeared to her stranger that he should inflict bodily pain upon his child than that he should have heard the truth, even in an exaggerated form. With a childish gesture she held out her arm to him, but if she expected pity, she received none. "Pooh!" said he, as he just glanced at the mark. "That is nothing, nothing. Answer my question. Have you met that man in private?" "Yes, papa, I have, but I don't think it was wrong." He sate down now. "Wrong?" he echoed bitterly. "Not wrong? Well, I must bear it somehow. Your mother is dead, that's one comfort. It is true, then, is it? Why, I did not believe it, not I. I laughed in my sleeve at their credulity, and I was the dupe all the time." "Papa, I cannot tell you all. It is not my secret, or you should know it directly. Indeed, you will be sorry some time. I have never deceived you yet, have I?" Trying to take one of his hands, but he kept them tightly in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the pattern of the carpet before him. "Papa!" she said, pleading again, "have I ever deceived you?" "How can I tell? I hear this from the town's talk. I don't know what next may come out." "The town's talk!" said Molly in dismay. "What business is it of theirs?" "Every one makes it their business to cast dirt on a girl's name who has disregarded the commonest rules of modesty and propriety." "Papa, you are very hard. Disregarded modesty? I will tell you exactly what I have done. I met Mr. Preston once, that evening when you put me down to walk over Croston Heath, and there was another person with him. I met him a second time, and that time by appointment, nobody but our two selves in the Towers Park. That is all, papa. You must trust me. I cannot explain more. You must trust me indeed." He could not help relenting at her words, there was such truth in the tone in which they were spoken. But he neither spoke nor stirred for a minute or two. Then he raised his eyes to hers for the first time since she had acknowledged the external truth of what he charged her with. Her face was very white, but it bore the impress of the final sincerity of death, when the true expression prevails without the poor disguises of time. "The letters?" he said, but almost as if he were ashamed to question that countenance any further. "I gave him one letter, of which I did not write a word, which, in fact, I believe to have been merely an envelope without any writing whatever inside. The giving that letter, the two interviews I have named, make all the private intercourse I have had with Mr. Preston. Oh, papa, what have they been saying that has shocked you so much?" "Never mind. As the world goes, what you say you have done, Molly, is ground enough. You must tell me all. I must be able to refute these rumours point by point." "How are they to be refuted, when you say that the truth which I have acknowledged is ground enough for what people are saying?" "You say you were not acting for yourself, but for another. If you tell me who the other was, if you tell me everything out fully, I will do my utmost to screen her. For, of course, I guess it was Cynthia, while I am exonerating you." "No, papa," said Molly, after some little consideration. "I have told you all I can, all that concerns myself, and I have promised not to say one word more." "Then your character will be impugned. It must be, unless the fullest explanation of these secret meetings is given. I have a great mind to force the whole truth out of Preston himself." "Papa, once again I beg you to trust me. If you ask Mr. Preston you will very likely hear the whole truth, but that is just what I have been trying so hard to conceal, for it will only make several people very unhappy if it is known, and the whole affair is over and done with now." "Not your share in it. Miss Browning sent for me this evening to tell me how people were talking about you. She implied that it was a complete loss of your good name. You do not know, Molly, how slight a thing may blacken a girl's reputation for life. I had hard work to stand all she said, even though I did not believe a word of it at the time. And now you have told me that much of it is true." "But I think that you are a brave man, papa, and you believe me, don't you? We shall outlive these rumours, never fear." "You don't know the power of ill-natured tongues, child," said he. Oh, now you've called me child again. I don't care for anything. Dear, dear papa, I'm sure it is best and wisest to take no notice of these speeches. After all, they may not mean them ill-naturedly. I am sure Miss Browning would not. By and by they'll quite forget how much they made out of so little, and even if they don't, you would not have me break my solemn word, would you? Perhaps not, but I cannot easily forgive the person who, by practising on your generosity, led you into this scrape. You are very young, and look on these things as merely temporary evils. I have more experience. Still, I don't see what I can do now, papa. Perhaps I've been foolish, but what I did of my own self. It was not suggested to me, and I'm sure it was not wrong in morals, whatever it might be in judgment. As I said, it is all over now, and what I did ended the affair, I am thankful to say, and it was with that object I did it. If people choose to talk about me, I must submit, and so must you, dear papa. Does Mrs. Gibson know anything about it? Asked he with sudden anxiety. No, not a bit, not a word. Pray don't name it to her. That might lead to more mischief than anything else. I have really told you everything I am at liberty to tell. It was a great relief to Mr. Gibson to find that his sudden fear that his wife might have been privy to it all was ill-founded. He had been seized by a sudden dread that she, whom he had chosen to marry in order to have a protectress and guide for his daughter, had been cognizant of this ill-advised adventure with Mr. Preston. Nay, more, that she might even have instigated it to save her own child, for that Cynthia was somehow or other at the bottom of it all, he had no doubt whatever. But now, at any rate, Mrs. Gibson had not been playing a treacherous part. That was all the comfort he could extract out of Molly's mysterious admission that much mischief might result from Mrs. Gibson's knowing anything about these meetings with Mr. Preston. "Then what is to be done?" said he. "These reports are abroad. Am I to do nothing to contradict them? Am I to go about smiling and content with all this talk about you passing from one idle gossip to another?" "I'm afraid so. I'm very sorry, for I never meant you to have known anything about it, and I can see now how much it must distress you. But surely when nothing more happens, and nothing comes of what has happened, the wonder and the gossip must die away. I know you believe every word I have said, and that you trust me, papa. Please, for my sake, be patient with all this gossip and cackle." "It will try me hard, Molly," said he. "For my sake, papa." "I don't see what else I can do," replied he moodily, "unless I get hold of Preston." "That would be the worst of all. That would make a talk. And, after all, perhaps he was not so very much to blame." "Yes, he was. But he behaved well to me as far as that goes," said she, suddenly recollecting his speech when Mr. Sheepshanks came up in the Towers Park. "Don't stir. You have nothing to be ashamed of." "That is true. A quarrel between men which drags a woman's name into notice is to be avoided at any cost. But sooner or later I must have it out with Preston. He shall find it not so pleasant to have placed my daughter in equivocal circumstances." "He did not place me. He did not know I was coming, did not expect to meet me either time, and would far rather not have taken the letter I gave him if he could have helped himself." "It is all a mystery. I hate to have you mixed up in mysteries." "I hate to be mixed up, but what can I do? I know of another mystery which I am pledged not to speak about. I cannot help myself." "Well, all I can say is, never be the heroine of a mystery. That you can avoid if you can't help being an accessory. Then I suppose I must yield to your wishes and let this scandal wear itself out without any notice from me?" "What else can you do under the circumstances?" "Ay, what else indeed? How shall you bear it?" For an instant the quick hot tears sprang into her eyes. To have everybody, all her world, thinking evil of her, did seem hard to the girl who had never thought or said an unkind thing of them. But she smiled as she made answer. "It's like tooth drawing. It will be over some time. It would be much worse if I had been really doing wrong." "Cynthia shall beware," he began. But Molly put her hand before his mouth. "Papa, Cynthia must not be accused or suspected. You will drive her out of your house if you do. She is so proud and so unprotected, except by you. And Roger, for Roger's sake, you will never do or say anything to send Cynthia away, when he has trusted us all to take care of her and love her in his absence. Oh, I think if she were really wicked, and I did not love her at all, I should feel bound to watch over her, he loves her so dearly. And she is really good at heart, and I do love her dearly. You must not vex or hurt Cynthia, papa. Remember, she is dependent upon you." I think the world would get on tolerably well if there were no women in it. They plague the life out of one. You've made me forget amongst you poor old Job Houghton that I ought to have gone to see an hour ago." Molly put up her mouth to be kissed. "You're not angry with me now, papa, are you?" "Get out of my way," kissing her all the same. "If I'm not angry with you, I ought to be, for you've caused a great deal of worry, which won't be over yet awhile, I can tell you." For all Molly's bravery at the time of this conversation, it was she that suffered more than her father. He kept out of the way of hearing gossip, but she was perpetually thrown into the small society of place. Mrs. Gibson herself had caught cold, and moreover was not tempted by the quiet old-fashioned visiting which was going on just about this time, provoked by the visit of two of Mrs. Dawes' pretty, unrefined nieces, who laughed and chattered and ate, and would fain have flirted with Mr. Ashton, the vicar, could he have been brought by any possibility to understand his share in the business. Mr. Preston did not accept the invitations to Hollingford tea drinkings with the same eager gratitude as he had done a year before, or else the shadow which hung over Molly would have extended to him, her co-partner in the clandestine meetings which gave such umbrage to the feminine virtue of the town. Molly herself was invited, because it would not do to pass any apparent slight on either Mr. or Mrs. Gibson; but there was a tacit and underhand protest against her being received on the old terms. Every one was civil to her, but no one was cordial. There was a very perceptible film of difference in their behaviour to her from what it was formerly. Nothing that had outlines could be defined. But Molly, for all her clear conscience and brave heart, felt acutely that she was only tolerated, not welcomed. She caught the buzzing whispers of the two Miss Oakses, who, when they first met the heroine of the prevailing scandal, looked at her askance, and criticised her pretensions to good looks with hardly an attempt at undertones. Molly tried to be thankful that her father was not in the mood for visiting. She was even glad that her stepmother was too much of an invalid to come out, when she felt thus slighted, as it were, degraded from her place. Miss Browning herself, that true old friend, spoke to her with chilling dignity and much reserve, for she had never heard a word from Mr. Gibson since the evening when she had put herself to so much pain to tell him of the disagreeable rumours affecting his daughter. Only Miss Phoebe would seek out Molly with even more than her former tenderness, and this tried Molly's calmness more than all the slights put together. The soft hand pressing hers under the table, the continual appeals to her so as to bring her back into the conversation, touched Molly almost to shedding tears. Sometimes the poor girl wondered to herself whether this change in the behaviour of her acquaintances was not a mere fancy of hers; whether, if she had never had that conversation with her father, in which she had borne herself so bravely at the time, she should have discovered the difference in their treatment of her. She never told her father how she felt these perpetual small slights. She had chosen to bear the burden of her own free will; nay, more, she had insisted on being allowed to do so; and it was not for her to grieve him now by showing that she shrank from the consequences of her own act. So she never made even an excuse for not going into the small gaieties, or mingling with the society of Hollingford. Only she suddenly let go the stretch of restraint she was living in, when one evening her father told her that he was really anxious about Mrs. Gibson's cough, and should like Molly to give up a party at Miss Goodenough's, to which they were all three invited, but to which Molly alone was going. Molly's heart leaped up at the thought of stopping at home, even though the next moment she had to blame herself for rejoicing at a reprieve that was purchased by another's suffering. However, the remedies prescribed by her husband did Mrs. Gibson good, and she was particularly grateful and caressing to Molly. "Really, dear," said she, stroking Molly's head, "I think your hair is getting softer, and losing that disagreeable crisp curly feeling." Then Molly knew that her stepmother was in high good humour. The smoothness or curliness of her hair was a sure test of the favour in which Mrs. Gibson held her at the moment. "I am so sorry to be the cause of detaining you from this little party, but dear papa is so over anxious about me. I have always been a kind of pet with gentlemen, and poor Mr. Kirkpatrick never knew how to make enough of me. But I think Mr. Gibson is even more foolishly fond. His last words were, 'Take care of yourself, Hyacinth,' and then he came back again to say, 'If you don't attend to my directions, I won't answer for the consequences.' I shook my forefinger at him, and said, 'Don't be so anxious, you silly man.'" "I hope we have done everything he told us to do," said Molly. "Oh, yes. I feel so much better. Do you know, late as it is, I think you might go to Miss Goodenough's yet. Maria could take you, and I should like to see you dressed. When one has been wearing dull warm gowns for a week or two, one gets quite a craving for bright colours and evening dress. So go and get ready, dear, and then perhaps you'll bring me back some news. For really, shut up as I have been with only papa and you for the last fortnight, I've got quite moped and dismal, and I can't bear to keep young people from the gaieties suitable to their age." "Oh, pray, mamma, I had so much rather not go." "Very well, very well. Only I think it's rather selfish of you, when you see I am so willing to make the sacrifice for your sake." "But you say it is a sacrifice to you, and I don't want to go." "Very well. Did I not say you might stop at home? Only pray don't chop logic. Nothing is so fatiguing to a sick person." Then they were silent for some time. Mrs. Gibson broke the silence by saying in a languid voice, "Can't you think of anything amusing to say, Molly?" Molly pumped up from the depths of her mind a few little trivialities which she had nearly forgotten, but she felt that they were anything but amusing, and so Mrs. Gibson seemed to feel them, for presently she said, "I wish Cynthia was at home." And Molly felt it as a reproach to her own dulness. "Shall I write to her and ask her to come back?" "Well, I'm not sure. I wish I knew a great many things. You've not heard anything of poor dear Osborne Hamley lately, have you?" Remembering her father's charge not to speak of Osborne's health, Molly made no reply, nor was any needed, for Mrs. Gibson went on thinking aloud. "You see, if Mr. Henderson has been as attentive as he was in the spring, and the chances about Roger, I shall be really grieved if anything happens to that young man, uncouth as he is, but it must be owned that Africa is not merely an unhealthy, it is a savage, and even in some parts a cannibal country. I often think of all I've read of it in geography books as I lie awake at night, and if Mr. Henderson is really becoming attached, the future is hidden from us by infinite wisdom, Molly, or else I should like to know it. One would calculate one's behaviour at the present time so much better if one only knew what events were to come. But I think on the whole we had better not alarm Cynthia. If we had only known in time, we might have planned for her to come down with Lord Cumnor and my lady." "Are they coming? Is Lady Cumnor well enough to travel?" "Yes, to be sure, or else I should not have considered whether or no Cynthia should have come down with them. It would have sounded very well, more than respectable, and would have given her a position among that lawyer set in London." "Then Lady Cumnor is better?" "To be sure. I should have thought papa would have mentioned it to you; but, to be sure, he is always so scrupulously careful not to speak about his patients. Quite right, too; quite right and delicate. Why, he hardly ever tells me how they are going on. Yes, the Earl and the Countess, and the Lady Harriet, and Lord and Lady Cuxhaven, and Lady Agnes, and I've ordered a new winter bonnet and black satin cloak." End of Chapter 48. Read by Tora in Yellowstone National Park, December 2006.